On June 24th, France's Public Health Agency recorded 1,200 deaths in a single day. The next day, it recorded over 1,400. In the months before the heatwave began, the country had been averaging around 900 to 1,000 deaths a day. Nothing else had changed. No new disease, no accident, no disaster anyone could point to on a map. Just heat. By late July, the official European Mortality Tracking Network confirmed that more than 10,000 people had died across the continent in what should have been a normal stretch of early summer. More than 9,000 of them were 65 or older. And that number, the one health agencies are willing to put their name on right now, is already understood by the people who calculated it to be incomplete. It is going to keep climbing for months after this heat wave itself is over. This video is not about a single storm or a single week. It is about how a modern, wealthy continent with hospitals, early warning systems, and decades of climate research behind it is still losing thousands of people to heat, and about why nobody will be able to tell you the real final number until long after the headlines have moved on. If this kind of reporting matters to you, consider subscribing so you see how the final figures come together. Here's what this video will walk through. How Europe counts a death toll that has no single obvious source, why the itself broke, how this event compares to the heat waves that came before it, and why, even with all of today's tracking technology, an exact final count may never actually exist. How do you count a death toll with no single cause of death? A car accident has a police report. A building collapse has a wreckage site. A heat wave has neither. Nobody dies with heat stamped cleanly on a death certificate the way a bullet or a broken bone would be. Instead, extreme heat kills by pushing people who were already vulnerable past a threshold their body could not recover from. A heart that was already strained, lungs that were already compromised, kidneys that could not keep up with the fluid loss. The heat is rarely the only cause listed. It is the trigger. Because of that, health agencies do not count heat deaths directly. They count something called excess mortality, the gap between how period and how many would normally have been expected to die based on recent years of data for that same country, region, and time of year. If a country typically sees 1,000 deaths a day in late June and suddenly sees 1,400, that extra 400 is the signal being measured, not a name-by-name list of heat victims. This method is powerful precisely because it does not require doctors to individually attribute each death to heat, something that rarely happens in practice. A death certificate might list cardiac arrest, respiratory failure, or kidney failure as the cause, all of which are real and accurate, even when heat was the underlying reason the body could not cope that particular day. Excess mortality sidesteps that ambiguity entirely by looking at the population-level pattern instead of chasing an impossible individual determination for every single case. But the method comes with a real cost. Excess mortality can only be calculated after the fact, once enough time has passed to see the full shape of the mortality curve. And it takes weeks or months for national statistics offices to finalize and cross-check the underlying data. Death registrations are not instantaneous. A person who dies at home may not be formally registered for days. Rural regions and countries with less digitized health systems report more slowly than others. That lag is the entire reason the number reported the week after a heat wave is never the number that ends up in the history books. And it is why journalists and health officials alike keep repeating the phrase, "The toll is expected to rise," almost every time one of these events makes headlines. The climb from hundreds to thousands. The scale of this became visible gradually, not all at once. In the last week of June, Europe's mortality surveillance network, known as Euromomo, recorded roughly 12,000 to 14,000 excess deaths in that single week alone, the highest weekly figure the network had recorded since it began tracking mortality data across the continent in 2020. By late June, the World Health Organization's regional director for Europe stated publicly that more than 1,300 excess deaths had been recorded since June 21st. That figure was already understood at the time to be a floor, not a ceiling, since it only reflected the countries that had reported data quickly enough to be included. By mid-July, as more national health agencies finished processing their numbers, the confirmed total from Euromomo passed 10,000. A separate analysis, compiled by Politico using national health data, put the toll at roughly 14,000 excess deaths across just 6 countries during the June heatwave alone, a higher figure than Euromomo's continent-wide count at the time, illustrating just how much the final number depends on which countries, which time window, and which methodology you use to measure it. France's National Public Health Agency reported at least 5,964 excess deaths tied to the June heatwave, describing it as 36% above what would normally be expected, and the highest mortality spike the country had recorded since the catastrophic 2003 heatwave. Germany's toll, according to mortality monitoring cited in multiple reports, exceeded 5,000. The United Kingdom recorded more than 2,700. Belgium's Public Health Institute, Cienzano, separately reported 1,747 excess deaths during the specific stretch from June 18th to July 1st, describing the breadth of the event as exceptional even by the standards of a country that expects some excess mortality during any heat wave. None of these national totals simply add together into one clean continental number because reporting timelines, data quality, and methodology differ from country to country, and some deaths counted in one national estimate may already be reflected, partially or differently, in another. That is precisely why the honest answer to what is the death toll kept changing, depending on exactly when and who you ask the question. Why this heat wave specifically? Meteorologists trace the severity of this event to what is called an omega block, a weather pattern named for the Greek letter it resembles on a pressure map. Hot, dry air moving north from North Africa became trapped in place over Western Europe, held there by low-pressure systems on either side that prevented it from moving on the way weather normally does, essentially locking the same mass of superheated air over the same cities for days at a time instead of letting it pass through and dissipate. The result was days of temperatures running as much as 18 degrees Celsius above their seasonal average, arriving earlier in the summer than almost anyone was prepared for. Europe is structurally exposed to this kind of event in a way that is easy to overlook. Only around 20% of European homes have air conditioning, since most of the continent's housing stock was built to retain heat through long, damp winters, not shed it during short, historically mild summers. A heat wave that might be uncomfortable in a country built around cooling technology becomes genuinely dangerous in a country whose buildings were engineered for the opposite problem. The people dying are also not evenly distributed across the population. The overwhelming majority, consistently more than 85 to 90% depending on the country, are people 65 and older, many already managing heart disease, respiratory illness, or kidney conditions that leave the body with far less capacity to cool itself or cope with dehydration. Deaths clustered disproportionately in homes rather than hospitals, particularly in dense urban housing, without adequate ventilation, the kind of setting where a person can be in serious medical distress for hours before anyone realizes something is wrong. This is not a random tragedy distributed evenly across society. It is concentrated almost entirely among people who were already the most medically and socially vulnerable before the heat ever arrived. The World Weather Attribution Group, an international team of climate scientists who specialize in linking specific extreme weather events to climate change, concluded that a heat wave this severe, this early in the summer, would have been virtually impossible without the warming that has already occurred. Separately, researchers at Imperial College London, the UK Met Office, and the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine estimated that roughly 42% of the deaths recorded during the heat wave were attributable specifically to the additional heat that climate change contributed, on top of what a heat wave of this kind would have caused a few decades ago. The World Health Organization's own leadership has described events that used to occur once every 300 years as now arriving more often than once a decade. How this compares to what came before. Placed next to Europe's recent history, this event fits an unmistakable pattern rather than standing apart from it. The devastating 2003 heat wave, still the reference point most European health agencies measure against, caused more than 70,000 excess deaths and forced many countries to build their first serious heat response plans. Despite those plans, the summer of 2022 still produced an estimated 61,600 heat-related deaths across 35 countries, according to research published in Nature Medicine. The summer of 2024, Europe's hottest on record at the time, produced an estimated 62,700 heat-attributable deaths, a 23% increase over the prior year, according to the same Barcelona-based research group. And what makes the current event notable is not that it broke some previous scale, but that it arrived earlier in the year and moved faster than expected, catching health systems and vulnerable populations off guard before the usual summer heat response protocols, such as staffed cooling centers and welfare checks on elderly residents, were fully in place. And this heat wave has not been an isolated event. By late July, Western Europe was already experiencing its third heat wave in 6 weeks, with renewed extreme heat feeding major wildfires across France, Spain, Portugal, Italy, and Greece, forcing more than 320,000 evacuations and killing at least 16 civilians and 3 firefighters directly, separate from the mortality toll attributed to heat itself. Why the final number will take months and may never be exact. Excess mortality figures are, by design, provisional for a long time after the event that caused them. National statistics offices need weeks to finalize death registrations, cross-check them against historical baselines, and rule out other contributing factors like a bad flu season or a heavy pollen year that could inflate the numbers for unrelated reasons. Multiply that process across dozens of countries with different reporting systems and different registration speeds, and a single, final, universally agreed number becomes something that realistically will not exist until well into next year, if it ever fully exists at all. There's also a deeper, permanent gap between the official count and the true toll. Public health researchers, including specialists who study exactly this kind of disaster, have pointed out that heat-related deaths are structurally undercounted because so many of them happen quietly at home to people who are already managing other health conditions without anyone in the room specifically attributing the death to the temperature outside. The 2024 heat toll of 62,700 was itself a revision upward from earlier, more conservative estimates, and researchers studying this summer's numbers widely expect the same pattern to repeat. Whatever figure gets reported this month will very likely be revised upward, not downward, as more complete data comes in over the following months. That is the uncomfortable core of this story. The 10,000 plus figure confirmed so far is not a final tally, and it is not even the highest credible estimate currently in circulation. It is a floor, measured in real time during an event that, as of the most recent reporting, was still ongoing. The actual number belonging to this summer will not be known, for certain until long after most people have stopped paying attention to it, which has been true of nearly every major European heat wave on record, and shows no sign of changing for this one. If you want to understand how these figures get revised as more data comes in, subscribe to follow the story as it develops. What do you think needs to change first? Building codes, early warning systems, or something else entirely to bring this number down in future summers? Let us know in the comments.